Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 3. Last time, we managed to break into the first cavern layer, and discovered a neat little place to do some farming in a much higher quality soil than we did until now. Today, we are going to capitalize on this, and we will get started on a small clothing industry. Anyways, let's not waste any more time, let's continue this tale.
We pick up where we left off, on the 15th of the month of Felsight. The discovery of the world-spanning cave network turned out to be a fortunate turn of event for our dwarves. By this time, they already took steps to move their plump helmet farms down, and the expedition leader already started drawing up plans on how to arrange that space. But he was also thinking about how to convert the old farms into a space for other crops. They had the seeds since their arrival, a year earlier, and it was time to make use of them. To prepare, they immediately started working on 3 new workshops. One was set up to be a place for processing their new crops. One of these will be the fungus known as pigtails, a very fibrous kind of mushroom, native to the caves. Thanks to its long strands of fibers, it is a cheap source of thread and cloth for dwarves worldwide. Immediately next to this was a place set up as a loom, where they could take these freshly made threads of pigtail, and weave it into cloth. As you might have guessed, dear audience, the third workshop was one filled with needles, spindles, and all sorts of tools used by tailors and clothiers. The manager Melville also managed to leave enough space in between these shops, so they could store all the necessary things nearby. No need to walk all the way down to the warehouse, everything they need will be in arm's reach. Work immediately began, all the threads and silk strands were weaved into textile sheets, ready to be turned into all sorts of clothing items. With that out of the way, the dwarves' attention turned toward their new plump helmet farm. It took a bit of extra effort on Melville's part to organize everything. They needed to move quite a bit downstairs. After cleaning out the newly dug out spaces, work began. Since the source of plump helmets was now down in the caverns, there was no point making long trips with the fresh harvest. It would be easier if the processing also moved downstairs. They also found 2 rock formations next to the fields, which allowed them to carve out 2 secluded little alcoves, which ended up serving as the storage spaces for the fresh mushrooms, as well as their seed spawns. As an added benefit, these crafty dwarves managed to carve these new rooms out in a way that still only allowed access to them from inside the fortress. All the horrifying creatures from the caves were unable to get inside. As the manager Melville was arranging the new storage spaces, he kept hearing the scurrying sounds of tiny little arachnoid feet outside the stone door, separating the fort from the abyss of the caverns. It seemed that when they broke into the tunnels, the cave spiders got scared, and hurriedly scattered into the surrounding holes and crevices. But now that the door was safely separating the 2 worlds, they came back to their old habitat, spinning their valuable silk, hoping to catch some small vermin. During the early days of hematite, the new farm was complete. In the soil of the caves, the plump helmets ended up growing into much denser clusters of mushroom sprouts, and having the needed infrastructure right next to it made sure that very little trips would be made unnecessarily. The expedition leader, a dwarf named Tun, was busy scribbling new ideas on his piece of paper, where he started to plan this new extension to the fort. But having the farming split between 2 areas quite far apart from each other got a bit tiresome to the local farmer, Solon. When he confronted the leader Tun about this issue, they came to an agreement, and the dwarf Errol was named as Solon's new assistant. It will take some time for her to be as proficient at the job as her superior, but at least she didn't have to do all that job by herself. By the time they were a third through the month of hematite, the new industrial farming area was more or less ready. It had the 3 workshops needed for the clothing production, and since the alcohol still was moved downstairs, it was replaced by a kitchen and a fishery. After a year of only eating plump helmets, the dwarves were ready for some variety in their diet, so the decision was made to start fishing once more. The leader Tun, however, did make sure to install a big sign in the kitchen, which said, "Do not cook plump helmets." It was well known throughout the 4 kingdoms that cooking the mushrooms completely destroyed their spawns, making replantation impossible. The brewing process was more gentle in this regard, but cooking had to be strictly forbidden, so the danger of running out of mushroom seedlings was not a danger. In the third week of that month, two big events happened. The first one was the arrival of a caravan from the nearby human settlement of E03. Needless to say, the preparations began immediately, so by the time the caravan arrived, the trade depot was ready to receive them. The second event occurred when one of the dogs got into a bit of a scuffle with a kangaroo outside. It seemed that the dog came out victorious, but the kangaroo was just scared away. Unfortunately for everyone, it was fleeing straight towards the fort entrance. In the meantime, the upstairs farms were starting to be converted to their new crops. There were 4 farm fields available, and 5 different seeds at their disposal. Cave wheat was a grain-like plant, which was the main ingredient in the brewing of dwarven beer. There were also sweet pods, the source of another drink they liked, dwarven rum. One of the fields was dedicated to growing the fibrous pigtails for their newly established clothing industry, and the last one was set aside for quarry bushes, which will end up supplying the fort with leaves, adding some much-needed fiber to their diet. Right around that time, the kangaroo that was chased around by one of the dogs managed to wander into the deepest parts of the fortress, and was making the farmers working on those fields anxious. The choice had to be made. They couldn't afford to have wild animals loose in the corridors, so one of the miners, a dwarfess named Sorol, was selected to track down and kill the beast. It took her quite a bit of effort, but eventually, she managed to kill it, and the fort was safe once more. If only this was the end of Sorol's place in this tale. Sadly for her, she will be called upon once more to defend the fortress in a couple months' time. The leader did write down in his journal that he was considering placing a pair of rope restraints at the entrance, so the 2 dogs could be kept there to guard the fortress. His hesitation in this matter ended up costing the fort dearly. On the 21st of Hematite, the time to allow fishing has come. 3 of them were chosen. Udil, Onel, and Muthkat were told that from then on, they were the anglers of the group, and expected to bring in freshly caught fish every day, so the dwarves stopped grumbling about the monotonous diet of plump helmets. As a coincidence, Onel has gone into labor the very same day, and gave birth to a girl, who she named Seabrek. As a mother of 2 other children before the new arrival, she was on her feet by the end of the day, and with little Seabrek bundled up in a pigtail papoose, they were off to keep working for the betterment of Diamond Verses. If it wasn't already obvious that dwarves were a sturdy and hard-working folk, this should make it abundantly clear. Near the end of the month, the decision was made to open the temple to the wider public, so any traveler passing by could come in, and take a small rest before leaving. The tavern, however, was kept closed to outsiders for now. Some of the other species were not known to handle the strong dwarven drinks all that well, and overconsumption often led to bar fights, which were not advantageous toward fostering close diplomatic relations between civilizations. As these travelers were resting and meditating in the temple, sometimes they would overhear the local residents talking about the caves underneath the main halls, and sometimes they would go to the leader and ask if they could rent a room in the local tavern. In exchange, they would offer to keep the monsters in the caves at bay. While these offers were tempting, the leader was apprehensive about allowing the big folk take up residence. He wasn't opposed to them living there as a matter of race, his concerns were more practical. Dwarves only really knew how to make living in their halls comfortable for members of their race. Sooner or later, humans, elves, and other tall folk were known to become dissatisfied after a while. As a result, he was only prepared to let other dwarven visitors settle down. Right around this time, the expedition leader thought it was time to finish those statues for the temple. They ran out of the necessary materials earlier, and now that they had enough, they could try again. This time, however, he left the matter up to the manager, Melville. Just as before, the statues were made out of claystone, and since the old sketches were still waiting in the mason's workshop, the stone cutter didn't need any time to prepare. As soon as the stone arrived, work began immediately on the remaining statues, depicting the 4 gods yet to receive their place in the temple. Lorbam, Osram, Nekol, and the Sienna Iron will soon be able to gaze down on their followers. Meanwhile, the human caravan on the surface has been waiting patiently for weeks at that point, and Melville thought it would be proper to at least look at what they had to offer. They did offer a couple barrels of human-made beverages, which ended up increasing the booze variety available, even if only for a little while. Melville also decided to pick up a couple crates of wool cloth, just in case. They also had a wide selection of fish on offer, and as tempting as it was to buy some of the more exotic species, he knew the fort should conserve some of the more valuable gems until the autumn caravan arrives from the homeland. Trading with the humans was a straightforward transaction, no need to impress them with gifts, so after a bit of haggling, Melville gave them a handful of gemstones, as well as most of the claystone mugs that couldn't fit into the chest in the tavern, but made sure to keep some of the really expensive diamonds for later. He did notice a particularly nice-looking mug in the pile, and put that one aside. He was sure the others would appreciate if they could take a drink out of something so masterfully crafted. Once everything was finalized, all the newly acquired items were taken down to the warehouse. On his way down to oversee the packing of the goods, he did notice that all the clothes and threads were still in the warehouse, instead of at the new clothing workshop. He quickly discovered the error. He forgot to tell the others to move all those things over. On the 9th of Malachite, the joyous news started spreading around the fortress. The fisher dwarf Muthcat gave birth to the second dwarven child of the fort. This time, it was a boy named Col. Must have been a worshipper of the god of travelers and jewels. After making sure all the newly acquired items were safely stored away in the warehouse, Melville sat down in his office, and started to organize the new clothing orders. He made sure to give clear instructions to be displayed in the workshop. If there was to be a shortage of a kind of clothing item in the fort, new ones were to be made immediately. It has already been well over a year since their arrival, and some of their socks started to develop holes. Most dwarves would have been satisfied with a simple assortment of trousers and shirts, but Melville decided to be more generous. Apart from the bare essentials, he also gave the orders to keep some other clothes in stock. Caps for covering their heads, 2 pairs of socks and shoes, a pair of gloves in case they need it, and he also added an order for loincloths. Better have it and not need it, than need it and not have it, he reasoned. He even ordered some stylish vests to be made, which will fit over their new coats nicely. They were lacking some of these items already, like the caps, the vests, sometimes even the loincloths. These will surely be snatched up by the first dwarf that happens upon them, but that's why they were made after all. Once the work orders were drawn up, he quickly put his stamp on the papers, took them to the clothier's shop, and stuck them to the wall for all to see, making sure they follow these orders to the letter. Not long after, work began, with the first items made being a pigtail cap. By that time, some of the statues for the temple were completed already. The images of Lorbam and Nekol Skullsghost were quickly hauled down to the temple, and put into their respective alcoves along the 2 sides of the chamber. The third one, sculpted to resemble the god Osram, was also waiting in the mason's shop by then. Only one remained. The worshippers visiting the temple couldn't stop admiring the craft workmanship of some of the later statues. None of them were what one would consider to be a masterpiece, but the skill and talent that went into them was still evident to everyone who laid eyes on them. The next thing needed for the temple were the pews. Nobody minded standing, or even sitting on the floors while praying or just meditating, but the expedition leader still thought it would be a nice addition to include for everyone's comfort. They were obviously trying to make them out of the same material, and since the most abundant wood in the warehouse was willow, that's what they went with. On the 21st of Malachite, a dwarf showed up at the gate, asking for an audience with the leader. She was called Sorol, just like the miner who took down that kangaroo a couple months before, and she was wearing a mismatched set of armor. A pair of steel boots, a pair of bismuth gloves and a helm, a bronze mail shirt, and copper chain leggings. On her back was a shield made of iron, and a battle-axe forged out of silver. Just like the human adventurers before her, she was also asking for a place to stay, and in exchange, she offered her services as a monster hunter. Since she was a dwarf, the expedition leader this time happily accepted the offer. But as they were conversing at the gate, the leader noticed that a couple humans from the caravan were still loitering nearby. Their wares were still sitting in the trade depot, and when asked why they haven't left, they were just staring up in the sky, looking rather miffed at a flock of Kia birds. Not knowing what to make of this, they were left to their own devices. Why they didn't pick up their wares from the depot was left unanswered. Weird creatures, those humans. By the third month of the summer, the textile industry was in full swing, and the dwarves were busy snatching up the new clothes as they were being made. This meant that their rooms started to look like the floor of a particularly messy laundry operation. To help them put away their new attires, a set of cabinets were ordered, one for each room. The dwarven caravan was expected to arrive by the middle of autumn, and the leader Tun was hopeful that they could shower them with enough gemstones to encourage some new migrants to show up. He was so hopeful that he even started planning a new set of rooms for these new arrivals to sleep in. While planning these new rooms, he did make a couple small mistakes, which he did admit to in his notes, but once the error was clear to him, the project was quickly set on the right tracks. On the 11th of Galena, a new arrival showed up, another dwarven adventurer called Erip. She was a weird one. Her attire was almost as ramshackle as Sorol's was. She assured the leader that her skills with a spear were more than adequate, one could call her competent even. But there was a distinct lack of a weapon on her person. Instead, she kept clutching a gorgeous-looking book in her hand. When asked about it, she was happy to show it around. It was titled, The Forest Retreat, Before and After. The most remarkable thing about it was that the covers were studded with diamonds. Otherwise, the words written in it were rather unremarkable. It was just a recollections of a human named Bustler from the city of No Jumps. Despite her not owning a weapon, she was still given refuge, because that book was a curious tome indeed. Such a valuable cover, for such a worthless written content. Before the new rooms could be fully completed, the fort's supply of bricks ran out. Good thing it was not an important project, so it was left like that for the time being. By then, the last statue was completed, and quickly taken down to the temple. It was the one showing the image of the Sienna Iron, the god of caverns and earth. Unlike the others, which were all showing various dwarven figures, this one was actually showing a female troglodyte. Kind of fitting, considering that these creatures were native to the caves, so the association was unmistakable. The leader's next idea was to start building some stone tables and chairs for the tavern, so anyone enjoying themselves could take a seat if they wished. And to make things a bit more varied, it was decided that these new additions should be made out of something other than dolomite, or claystone. The choice fell on the stone known as microcline, a rock best known for its light blue color. Since the fort was lacking the stocks for this endeavor, it was deemed necessary to start digging out a quarry, specifically created for the extraction of these stones. Should they run into some metal or veins, or a couple clusters of gemstones, then it was a win-win. As the months went by, the two humans from the caravan were still outside, chasing birds around. It has become more and more evident to the dwarves that those two had some kind of a mental breakdown. Similar issues have been observed among their own kind, so they reasoned that something similar has happened to the humans too. At least, that became the working theory. Only the gods know the real reason for their unusual behavior. On the 3rd of the month of Limestone, the unthinkable happened. A trio of kobolds were discovered, skulking around the fort, looking for shiny things they could steal. Unfortunately, they were discovered by one of the fisher dwarves as they were coming home with their catch of the day, and the thieves were scared toward the main entrance. As they were cornered, their only option was to run into the fort, hoping for the best. They caused quite a commotion, and they had to be dealt with, and quick. The two monster hunters were out on patrol at the time, and weren't available to take care of the intruders. Since the only other resident with any kind of experience in fighting was Sorol, the miner, she was chosen to deal with them. She managed to corner them in the warehouse, and proceeded to kick the ever-loving hell out of them one by one. But by the time she got hold of the last one of the thieves, she was already exhausted, and after a lengthy scuffle, the kobold successfully landed a lucky blow. His dagger was jammed straight into Sorol's skull, killing the poor dwarf instantly. When one of her friends, Nil, saw what happened, he flew into a murderous rage, and proceeded to pummel the creature into a pulp with his pickaxe. After the tragic ordeal, the corpses of the invaders were stripped of their belongings, and tossed on the corpse pile outside. As for the heroic Sorol, she was to be the first dwarf to be buried with full honors in the fort. The mason immediately started working on a coffin for her, and work began on digging out the catacombs. It was inevitable, but the dwarves still hoped it would happen later, rather than sooner. The wall behind the temple altar was chosen for the crypts. Some dwarves liked to be close to their gods when laid to rest. It was dug out in the traditional fashion, narrow corridors, with small receptacles along the walls where the coffins would be placed. The coffin itself turned out to be rather plain, but those who knew Sorol were fine with it. She was a simple miner at heart, and if given the choice, she would have preferred to be laid to rest in a simple stone box. Her final resting place was in the first alcove in the catacombs, but the rest of the fort knew she deserved more than that. The mason was already busy drawing up sketches for a statue commemorating her accomplishments, which will most likely end up in the main entrance hall in the future. During all the commotion, the caravan has finally arrived from the mountain homes. There was no time for mourning. For the fort to survive, they needed to keep working. The order was given to move the valuable gems to the trade depot. During the negotiations with the caravan liaison, the expedition leader only asked for one thing: a breeding pair of chickens. Their eggs would add even more variety to their diets, something the dwarves were always eager to do. As soon as the storage bins filled to the brim with the gems were taken to the depot, the real negotiations began. Just as requested, the traders brought the goods they asked for with them: pig leather, spider silk, wools and linen of all sorts. When selecting the good to trade with though, Melville started to show off some of the more valuable gems the fort managed to acquire since their last visit. Among those gems, he even included 2 of the diamonds they dug out in the caverns a couple seasons ago. As the cloths and silks were being moved downstairs, Melville took a small wooden box out of his robes. On it was a wax seal, and a letter addressed to the Queen of the Realm. As he handed it to the caravan master, he made him swear to give it to her as soon as he arrives back home. Inside were another handful of gems, among them the last of their diamonds. They were hoping that such a show of gratitude toward the throne would encourage others to see the fort for themselves. Hoping that they will start seeing more migrants arrive, work on the new bedrooms began anew. Since they were out of stone blocks, the first order of business was to make more, so another work order was sent out. As their business with the caravan was concluded, their attention once more turned toward their safety. Sorol's untimely demise taught them a harsh lesson, so it was time to do something about it. The expedition leader finally decided to put his earlier idea into action. To ensure that no more unwelcome visitors would end up in the fort, 2 rope restraints were set up at the main entrance, and the 2 dogs were tied to them immediately after. He was hoping that this would discourage any more sneaky thieves from entering the fort. Thankfully, this was the only way into the fort. Unless we count the locked door leading into the caves. Of course, everyone knew that these dogs would only be able to scare away kobolds at most. They would be helpless against tougher enemies. With the safety of the fort taken care of, at least for the time being, it was time to finally move all those cabinets Melville ordered a while ago. They had been sitting in the warehouse for quite a while at that point, and with new clothes being made regularly, the dwarves would feel better if they could have a space to store them away. While arranging all this, the leader did notice that one of the walls between 2 rooms was not completed properly. Thankfully, it was between 2 unoccupied rooms, which is why nobody complained about it. Good thing this oversight was discovered before more migrants arrived. Would have been embarrassing to assign these rooms to the newcomers, only for them to discover that their rooms were a bit more open than advertised. As soon as the first of the newly ordered dolomite blocks were completed, the first set was used to rectify the situation. After 3 months, the 2 humans were still standing outside, shouting at birds. At this point, the dwarves made peace with their presence, and weren't all that bothered about them. Having their stuff in the depot was more bothersome though. If they don't come and claim it by the end of the year, the dwarves were prepared to just move everything into the warehouse. As the upstairs farms started to bear fruit, it was time to start dealing with the harvest. The cave wheat and the sweet pods were straightforward, they just needed to be brewed into beer and rum, but the pigtails and quarry bushes needed to be processed to be useful, so the manager Melville gave out the order. If there was some plants available that could be taken to the farmer's workshop, then it was to be done as soon as possible. And with the new quarry already full of microcline boulders, it was time to start working on the chairs for the tavern. A set of them were ordered, specifically made out of that bright blue rock. By the 16th of sandstone, all the cabinets were taken to the bedrooms, and the dwarves had a place to put away their new clothes at last. And the new quarry revealed all sorts of gems and minerals. They weren't as valuable as the diamonds they found in the caves, but they will still fetch a good price after being cut into the proper shapes. They even managed to strike a deposit of gypsum. It was an important material, it allowed the dwarves to create plaster casts, aiding in the setting of broken bones. With the unfortunate events of the last couple months, They were seriously thinking about setting up a place to care for the wounded, and this discovery came at the perfect moment. At the end of the month of Sandstone, one of the fisher dwarves was bringing in their daily catch from the small brook to the north, and as they passed through the gate, they tossed a couple of the smaller fishes to the dogs, and as she watched them playfully fight over the last tailfin, she had an idea. After dropping off the rest of the fishes, she met up with the leader, Tun, and asked if they could train the dogs. If they were taught how to be more formidable in a fight, they could defend the fort better. Tun liked the idea, and decided to give it a try. As he took a look at the two dogs, he saw the potential too, and began organizing the whole thing. First, he called a general meeting, and asked if anyone had any experience with training animals. Sadly, nobody knew how to do it properly, so it had to be done through trial and error. The dwarf Mestos was chosen for the job. She was the crafter of the group, and she had nothing better to do at the moment. Despite her lack of experience, she was quite enthusiastic about her new role, and stuck in immediately. On her way to the entrance where the two dogs were guarding the main doors, she took a small detour to the fishery to pick up some of the scraps. It didn't take long, and after a couple days, the change in the dogs was noticeable. They seemed to be acting more territorial, and while they were still as friendly and playful as ever with members of the fort, it was clear that if someone uninvited tried to enter through those doors, they would be met with a pair of vicious guard hounds. At that point, the dwarves were sleeping a little easier, and their attention once more turned toward making the fort nicer. They decided to give the tavern's main hall a small makeover, and use some of the claystone blocks they had to tile the floor in the middle. And I'm afraid, this is where we will leave the story for today. The month of Sandstone is coming to a close, and that is as far as I got into the fortress records. I hope you don't mind, dear audience, but I need to go back to the library, and look for the next book, so I can refresh my memory. Thank you for lending me your ears, and hope to see you again in a week from now.
Well, that's it. A real shame about that poor miner. She was doing quite well with the first two kobolds. I hope to include a small memorial in her honor in the next episode. I don't think we need to worry about anything more than kobold thieves, or maybe goblin snatchers at the moment, so the two guard dogs should be enough to dissuade anyone unwanted from entering the fortress. But it wouldn't hurt to be more prepared, so I might start working on a more substantial defense. Maybe a drawbridge at the main gate, and have a secondary way into the halls through a narrow corridor, filled to the brim with traps. Yeah, that should do it for a little while. Anyways, thank you for watching. If you liked the video, then leaving a like and subscribing to the channel just might motivate me to make more. If you are more in the donating mood, you can find a link to my Ko-fi page in the description, where you can buy me a glass of water. I don't really drink coffee. Thank you for your support, and until next time, I will see you later.